How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most mid podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome to a new album recap. We're going to be going over notable releases from the month of March of 2021. And honestly, March has been a pretty mid-month for music, honestly.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot to say about a whole lot of these albums, so this is going to be a bit of a pessimistic one. Yeah, so I think with that in mind, we should just get right into it. So we're going to start
I would say
with...
it's not all doom and gloom. Don't worry.
Yeah, there is some great albums throughout this, but I don't know, most of it was kind of mid for me, personally. But you'll find out as we go through this. So, okay, first album that we're going to be talking about today is When You See Yourself by the Kings of Leon. And this is the 8th studio album from the alternative rock and southern rock band the Kings of Leon. I only really remember the Kings of Leon from one song that was overplayed on the radio and on TV stations when I was a kid. But with this new album out entitled When You See Yourself, it looks like it might stay that way because this is honestly one of the dullest and forgettable alt-rock albums I've heard in a long while. You know, not that I think it's awful or mediocre even, I just think it's very average because nothing on this album really stands out to me. The production isn't that interesting, the grooves are comatose, the lyrics and vocal performances aren't interesting, and as a whole, I just feel nothing when listening to this, and there just isn't really a whole lot to say about it. It's just a Kings of Leon album in 2021. What more needs to be said?
Yeah, I would say, as a whole, I don't think they're a bad band. I do like a lot of their... a bit of an overstatement. A few of their tracks. But they're in no way, shape, or form an exciting band, and they honestly have never been one. So this new project, If You See Yourself, really doesn't change my opinion on the band in any way, shape, or form. It has some good moments, but just like the rest of the band's catalogue, it's quite uneventful and quite derivative. And, you know, just the instrumentation throughout is very cookie cutter, and it's very polished and just synthetic. It's still like a pleasant listening experience. You know, it's not an album that's going to make you throw up. But it just doesn't do much for me at all. You know, Caleb Followill sounds exactly like he has for the last 15 odd years. There's just nothing really to say about this project, honestly.
Yeah, my favourite track was The Bandit, my least favourite track was Supermarket, and I gave this album a light 5.
My favourite tracks were When You See Yourself, You're Far Away, and The Bandit. My least favourite track was Stormy Weather. Is this Stormy Weather? I think I misspelled it.
I'm not too sure. I don't even remember that track anyway.
The track that's Stormy. And I give this track album a light 5.
Okay, next we have As Days Get Dark by Arab Strap, and this is the 8th studio album from the Scottish indie duo, and from my understanding this is their first album in 13 years, so it's been a while since we've heard from these lads, but this is the first time I'm ever hearing from them. You know, it took me a couple of listens to fully wrap my head around this album, but, you know, there's only really one thing that puts me off from it, from thinking that it's great. I do like the album, I think it's good, but it's not that great. You know, to start with the positives, I really like the production. You know, the multi-instrumentalist of the duo, Malcolm Middleton, really outdid himself on the production and compositional end of things, as the sound of this album is very clean and pristine. The mixes are pretty pleasant, and there's some very good melancholic soundscapes presented alongside some very good sequencing and slow-burning instrumentation. The duo's frontman, Aidan Moffat, is delivering this dark, retrospective, and often dark pieces of spoken word poetry with this thick Scottish accent, and while my main gripe with the record is down to the vocals, he adds a lot of character and interesting charms to the record, honestly. You know, where it thrives in character and, you know, interesting production, it falters in memorability and replay value, as a lot of these tracks aren't all that memorable outside of the highlights. And while I think that the content of this album, you know, presents us with a lot of the is interesting to me. You know, a lot of the vocal performances and spoken word passages are very monotonous for the entire album's duration, and while I don't think there's a bad song on this album, it just doesn't warrant a whole lot of replay value, but I still think it's a good album nonetheless.
This is a bit interesting because my opinion on this album is kind of your opinion but flipped. I honestly just didn't really enjoy this album all that much. I found it just very boring, very repetitive. And a lot of, I did enjoy about this project did derive from the songwriting and Aiden's very broody and nocturnal vocals. I think, his performances throughout just oftentimes carry a lot of weight, carry a lot of memorability, and just provide a very engaging listening experience. But the instrumentation for me personally throughout is just honestly quite drab, very run-of-the-mill indie-tronica. It does create some nice atmospheres and textures, but throughout this project, I find myself getting really bored and just finding the instrumentation really tedious. A lot of what I like about this project just solely derives from the vocal performances from Aiden, and not much from the instrumental performances throughout. I don't think they're awful. I just don't think they're doing anything interesting, to be honest.
I mean, fair enough. I can kind of get that, but honestly, it's fine. I think the instrumentation is good for what it is, but I can totally get it.
Yeah, our opinions flipped, which is kind of funny though.
I love that. I love the juxtaposition there. So, my favorite tracks from As Days Get Dark are Another Clockwork Day, Tears on Tour, Fable of the Urban Fox, and I Was Once a Weak Man. My least favorite track is Compersion Part 1, and I gave this album a light 7.
My favorite tracks on As Days Get Dark are The Turning of Bones, Bluebird, and Sleeper. And my least favorite track was Tears on Tour, and I gave this album a light 5 out of 10.
Next we have Poster Girl by Zara Larsson, and this is the third studio album from the Swedish pop singer. And I remember Zara Larsson was huge back in 2017 for the track Lush Life, which was played to death on the radio every 5 minutes, but besides that, I don't really recall much else about Zara, and I don't really have a whole lot to say about Zara's newest album either, because, to put it simply, there isn't much to say about it. Poster Girl is just an amalgamation of a lot of generic, predictable, and annoying trends we saw in dance pop over the past decade, and even this album is just boring to the core. The production is really trite, squeaky clean, very predictable, and it's just so void of anything exciting. Zara herself doesn't do much to make this exciting in the slightest. She just seems to be wandering over these instrumentals with very little enthusiasm, and it just comes across very shallow and uninteresting. I found more interesting vocals on a fucking Gunna album than anything off of this. And, it features one of Young Thug's most boring features ever, and in general, that's just perfect way to describe this album. Just very boring, just painfully boring, might I add.
I do agree. First of all, I agree, especially vocally, Zara Larsson isn't really anything to write home about. Her voice is fine, her vocals are fine. Nothing in any way, shape, or form just mind-blowing. But this album as a whole, to me, feels like it has two types of tracks. One's where the new disco style is it feels fully committed to. It feels pretty well executed, and for the most part, these tracks are somewhat enjoyable. A little generic, especially considering the oversaturation of the genre at this point. But for what they are somewhat enjoyable tracks. But then there's the other tracks on this album, which just feel like this gross, combination of just contemporary R&B, trap, everything you've been hearing on the radio for the last 5 or so years, with absolutely nothing fresh, absolutely nothing new. Some weird half-arsed and half-baked new disco elements slapped on top because that's now the cool thing to do. And as a whole, this album is just really devoid of anything unique or interesting. It doesn't push pop in any direction. It just kind of exists.
Yeah, I agree. Best tracks, I don't like any tracks off this album, so I guess the title track. And the worst tracks are Wow, FFF, and What Happens Here, and I gave this album a light 3.
My favorite tracks were Poster Girl, Ruin My Life, and FFF. My least favorite tracks were Talk About Love, Wow, Stick With You, and What Happens Here, and I gave this album a decent 3 out of 10.
Alright, next we have Smiling With No Teeth by Genesis Owusu. This is the debut album from the Ghanaian-Australian singer-songwriter and rapper Genesis Owusu. And Smiling With No Teeth has been building up so much hype and acclaim around from critics and music fans alike, scoring very positive reviews and user scores from across the internet. And after listening to this record a few times, it's pretty easy to see why, because I genuinely think this album is pretty great, honestly. And you know, we're not even like a full quarter of the way through the year yet, and Smiling with No Teeth has proven itself to be one of the most diverse and versatile records of the year thus far stylistically, as this record has just got so much going on in terms of genre fusions and styles that it's impressive. You know, it breaks down the elements and fundamentals of certain genres and fuses them in a way that's pretty creative and sometimes very inventive. The sounds in particular that turn up on Smiling with No Teeth include just experimental and alternative hip-hop, neo-soul, alternative R&B, and even elements of fucking post-punk turn up on this album, which was just completely unexpected going into this. And the way that I see it, I think that Genesis, like, blends these styles and genres together so seamlessly in a way that's very admirable. It's like a freakish combination between, like, Thundercat, Death Grips, Childish Gambino, and Steve Lacy. And even if you're not a fan of this album, you have to admit, like, this album is ambitious in what it tries to do. Now, of course, this album like shouldn't just rely on the amount of genres that it blends together like some kind of gimmick, but Smiling with No Teeth manages to stray away from that label for me, because the songs themselves are really well put together, produced well, and oftentimes straight up fantastic. You know, the track list isn't short of highlights, because there's plenty to be found throughout its duration. You know, for its production, rapping, vocals, songwriting, sonic diversity. There's a fine balance between like the very smooth, soulful, and banger type tracks. There's even some there's something for everybody, I'd say, depending on what you're in the mood for. You know, I think Genesis as a performer is great on this record. He really has talent and proves it with a lot of his performances. He's very charismatic, energetic, smooth, and often accompanied by some conscious lyrics that add substance to this album. I suppose where it falters for me in some respects is, you know, it's some of the ideas that Genesis explores on this album, particularly on the first half. I feel like some of the ideas that he puts forward are a little underdeveloped and could have been fleshed out a little further, and I feel like the album's length kind of distances the record from gaining much frequent replay value for me. But besides that, pretty much everything that I said above applies to my enjoyment of this album. I love how ambitious this debut was, love how diverse it is. I think that Genesis has massive potential, and there's plenty of amazing songs on this album that I'll definitely be returning to. In short, simply a great debut, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. Genesis Owusu has really come out of nowhere to just being on everyone's radar. He's genuinely one of the most exciting artists around now. And Smiling with No Teeth is an exhilarating, insanely creative, and insanely eclectic album. And it's almost hard to keep up with all of the different sounds and ideas he's exploring on this project. And while this could have easily made for something completely disjointed, very sloppy, Smiling with No Teeth is an album that is so effortlessly idiosyncratic and confident in its ideas that it very rarely feels messy, it very rarely feels underdeveloped. He just hits the sweet spot with a lot of his experimentation so damn often. And while I do still think there is room for Genesis to grow and, you know, expand his sound even further, you know, I can't help but feel genuinely impressed with what he provides on this project. It's definitely, you know, a must-listen album and definitely a highlight of this year so far.
Yeah, and for me, it has plenty of maybe Song of the Month contenders, so there's that. And speaking of songs, my favourite tracks from Smiling with No Teeth are The Other Black Dog, Drown, Smiling with No Teeth, I Don't See Colour, Black Dogs, Whipcracker, and No Looking Fishing. My least favourite track is Centerfold, and I gave this album a light 8.
Right, my favourite tracks are On the Move, The Other Black Dogs, Waiting on You, Don't Need You, Drown, I Don't See Colour, and Whipcracker. My least favourite track was A Song About Fishing, and I gave this album a very strong 7 out of 10.
Wait, did I say that last track wrong? I said No Looking Fishing in my notes.
Oh, wait.
God.
I don't know. Either of us could be wrong.
I'm probably more than likely wrong, because that makes no sense for a song title. But yeah, enough about that. Let's move on to our next album, which is I Won't Care How You Remember Me by Tiger's Jaw. And this is the 6th album from the indie rock and emo pop band. And this is my first experience with Tiger's Jaw. I know that they're loved in the community, but I only heard about this band this year, and this album is ultimately my exposure to them. And while I think that it has its fair share of catchy and fun tracks, it's just pretty average to me. I think that the tracks that I loved are very well performed, they're very catchy and straight up fun overall. I think that the production is very pleasant and the instrumentation is pretty good mostly. But I feel like all of this isn't enough to make this album great for me, as majority of the tracks in this record don't go the extra mile or make themselves exciting. They often come across very bland, very derivative, and pretty forgettable. Now, I wouldn't say there's a bad song or even a lackluster one, but something just feels missing. Something is kind of lacking here, honestly, and that something kind of drags these songs down into being bland pastiche for me. And I don't really have much else to say besides that.
Honestly, I mean, is Tiger's Jaw in any way, shape, or form reinventing the emo genre or even their new sound on this new project? Not at all. But to me, that doesn't really automatically make the project bad because, I don't know, a lot of this album is just undeniably infectious to me. It's just, for me, what this seems like is just a band playing to their strengths. It doesn't make for a fantastic album, but it definitely delivers a solid helping of emo ballads that, you know, while not something that will go on to be a standout album at the end of the year, still, to me personally, remains solid and memorable throughout. Songwriting is good. Instrumentally, a lot of these tracks are quite fulfilling. And for someone as obsessed with emo as me, it definitely is a welcome album from a band that I do, consider myself a fan of. It's in no way, shape, or form as good as any other better stuff, but I mean, it's still an enjoyable project from start to finish. And honestly, I'd be picking at straws if I was to say I didn't like much about this, because I did genuinely have a good time with this project.
I mean, fair enough. It just doesn't stand out to me in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, no, that's understandable.
Yeah. My favourite tracks are Can't Wait Forever, Lemon Mouth, and Body Language. My least favourite tracks are Heaven Apart, Hesitation, and Anniversary. And I gave this album a strong 5.
My favourite tracks are Cat's Cradle, Hesitation, New Detroit, Can't Wait Forever, Lemon Mouth, Commit, Never Wanted to, and Anniversary. My least favourite track was I Won't Care How You Remember Me, and I gave this album a very light 7 out of 10.
Alright, next we have possibly the biggest album to come out last month, and that is Chemtrails Over the Country Club by Lana Del Rey. And this is the 6th studio album from singer-songwriter Lana Del Rey. And Chemtrails Over the Country Club was an album that I was honestly anticipating highly, given I was blown away by her very impressive 2019 album Norman fucking Rockwell. It was one of my favourite albums of 2019 and one that I consider to be Lana's best by a mile. I'm very indifferent towards everything that Lana had done prior to Norman fucking Rockwell, mostly because I found her to just be painfully superficial and boring. But, her last album really gave me hope that she would continue to progress and grow as an artist. Plus, given her, folk pop-centered direction and the singles, I had a good reason to be hyped for this album. But, after giving it a few listens, I don't really get much out of Chemtrails Over the Country Club overall, although I do think that it is a decent album and one of her better records. To start with some positives, I can appreciate that Lana continues to dabble in this folk pop sound while also adding some interesting textures and expansive sets of genres, while also being a little bit more subtle and intimate. I think that Lana has some very good vocal performances, especially on the first half of the album, and I feel like her vocals often, her hushed delivery works with the hollow sound palette of this record, and in general, there's no bad on this album. There's some very good, powerful tracks that I would rank among Lana's best. But unfortunately, there's just some glaring issues that plague this record for me. And it's mostly in a lot of its production, lyrics, and just how it's pretty derivative of a lot of stuff we saw on Norman fucking Rockwell. And when I say derivative, I don't think that she's really trying to grow artistically from Norman fucking Rockwell, but rather take this sound in a more subtle yet washed out direction. It kind of ends up crippling her vision yet again renders her sound into this boring mess to me. While the lyrics at times can be pretty decent, they aren't all that captivating. It just feels like more or less the same as usual for Lana, except it goes down that somewhat Norman fucking Rockwell road. Oftentimes the production is kind of sloppy, and while I think Jack Antonoff is a pretty good producer, there's just moments on this album that sound very rough around the edges and at times a little too overblown, sometimes to the point where the audio kind of clips in the mix. Lana is often decent and it has moments that are pretty good, but there's just moments where Lana comes off pretty awkward and in her delivery, her strained vocals, on White Dress in particular, and I feel like she gets outshined by her features. It has some good tracks, but overall it's just not very memorable to me. I came away pretty disappointed, and while it isn't a bad album, I think it has some great moments. I just think it's an alright record for now.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. Lana Del Rey was always an artist whose music I appreciated, and I've always understood her cult following. But personally, I was really never sold on her sound, on her just general atmosphere of her music and the whole aesthetic of it. I was just never really sold on it. There are a few tracks from her older albums that I genuinely do love, but for the most part, I just wasn't a big Lana Del Rey fan up until Norman fucking Rockwell. An album that completely blew me away, and just it felt like the sum of all the potential that I saw in her throughout the years, displayed in one, grandiose and eclectic and just exciting album. And it was definitely her artistic and ambitious peak, in my opinion. And 2 years later, my outlook on Lana, musically at least, I won't get into that politics, has completely changed. I was really genuinely looking forward to the new Lana Del Rey album, something that would have probably just flown over my head in years prior, but after NFR, it's hard not to be. And I was really excited to see what she would provide on her new project, but ultimately, while Chemtrails Over the Country Club is still a very palatable and mostly enjoyable project, I think it just lacks all of the depth and the ambition and the grandiosity that its predecessor, excelled in. It has some genuinely gorgeous and very layered and lush tracks, but there's moments on here that, for me, just do the bare minimum that one would expect from a Lana Del Rey track and end up being just totally forgettable and completely monotonous. The highlights are here. The highlights are definitely here, but especially after Norman fucking Rockwell, this project just isn't gonna go down as one of Lana's best albums. It's just gonna kind of be forgotten as time goes by, especially if she does, reach the potential that she has reached on Norman fucking Rockwell. But this project just, I don't think it's exactly a worthy follow-up, nor do I think it's a bad project. It's just kind of okay.
I agree. Alright, my favourite tracks from Chemtrails Over the Country Club are the title track and Wild at Heart. My least favourite tracks are Yosemite and Dance Till We Die, and I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Chemtrails Over the Country Club, Tulsa Jesus Freak, Wild at Heart, and For Free. My least favourite, This Dick Ain't Free. And my least favourite track was White Dress. Sorry. I can give this album a light 6. I'm so fucking disoriented.
No, that Kendrick reference just caught me off guard. Sorry. Okay. Oh god.
Disappointed
no.
It's not a cover.
Yeah. Anyways, Justice by Justin Bieber. Oh boy. Now, this is the 5th studio album from Canada's very own Justin Bieber, and Justin follows up his 2020 quote-unquote R&B album, Changes, which to me was an awful album. I didn't like a single thing on that album, and I'm not alone in that assessment, as it has some of the worst songs of 2020 on it, and it was just so painfully bland that it was just that hard to sit through. And it only proved that even that far into his career, like, Justin was still making the same kind of soulless and manufactured shite he's been making since he was a child. But when it comes to Justice, I have to give Justin some credit for a few things. I feel like I'm glad he didn't make another Changes, so that was nice. He actually got pretty versatile with what he tries stylistically on here, and in my opinion, it's not totally dog shit, but it's still very trite. It's still pretty mediocre in my opinion. And there's just moments on this album that are incredibly questionable because, Jesus Christ. I don't know what Justin was trying to do with those Martin Luther King snippets. Like, why? Why?
The only time when I was listening to the album and I was actually engaged was when fucking... Not when Justin was doing anything, but when I heard Martin Luther King. That was the only engaging part of the album. But also, why the fuck?
Like, I agree with that, but still, why? Like, I'll just explain that part in a second, but I'll just talk about whatever else was on this. I like that Justin, switches up some pop styles on this album with some of his regular contemporary pop and some R&B, and even some synth pop. And to my surprise, there are actually a lot of decent tracks on this album for me. But those decent tracks are few and far in between, as it's just more of the same helpings of bland pop tracks that are just about as stale as expired bread that you left outside on the road to rot. I somewhat like the lyrics for Lonely, but everything else is just the same drivel that we normally expect from Justin. It's just more of the same inoffensive stuff. And like the only thing I can say that I was engaged for and offended by on this record was just the Martin Luther King snippets. Like, Justin uses these like snippets in such a shitty and narcissistic way. He twists Martin Luther King's message for something that's just so fucking selfish. Like justice for who? Justin? Fuck you, dude. Fuck Justin, you. Dude. For fucking Justin. Well, he fucking deserves it at times, and he deserves it for this one. Like, come on. And, yeah, basically, fuck you. This album's mid.
Justin Bieber's a visionary.
Oh, God. His vision of yummy, of course.
Yeah, I won't waste too much time. Justin Bieber, again, releases an album that is so bland, lifeless, and generic that it's completely impossible to come up with anything meaningful to say about it. If you somehow just, I don't know, have the worst taste in music, no offense, and you enjoyed Changes, then, you know, go ahead, listen to this project. You'll get something out of it for sure, because, you know, he's not doing anything new, really. I will say it's slightly less dog shit than Changes, but that's also not saying a lot. And yeah, I've nothing to say about this project at all. Doo-doo.
Okay, my alright, best tracks off of Justice are Hold On and Deserve You. The worst tracks are MLK Interlude, Holy, Unstable, and Love You Different. And I gave this album a light 4. I was lenient on him this time around. Even
Whoa. That's the highest score Justin will ever get. I give this best tracks, Somebody if I had to pick. Worst tracks, Too Much, Deserve You, and Holy. My score was light 3 out of 10. My least favorite score, I was about to say.
Your least favorite score, 3 out of 10. Oh my. Okay, next we have To See the Next Part of the Dream by Parannoul. And this is the second album from the South Korean shoegaze and emo project Parannoul. And this album pretty much came out of nowhere. It came out a month ago, and we're only really including it now because, you know, we only saw it was getting like high ratings and high placements on the Rate Your Music charts recently. And I was curious to see like what this project was, who was behind it, and, you know, what they were about. But like, once you look into it, Parannoul is just this anonymous figure that no one really knows anything about besides what they say in their Bandcamp bio. You know, just a student writing music in their bedroom. And once you press play on the first track, it's pretty clear, like, that is the case. And that statement is in no way meant to, like, be a criticism or a joke. In fact, I think it's really impressive that they possibly made this experience all on their own in their bedroom. It's, like, sort of inspiring in a way to see what can be done by you with limited resources. And, you know, this person is clearly passionate and driven to make the best music that he can. And, you know, I think that this album is great, honestly. I really loved it. You know, the sound of this album is, you know, truly the main selling point for me. The album is very jagged with its lo-fi mixes, and especially with its guitars, vocals, and drums. It's very DIY, but that doesn't take away from the instrumentation. It only adds further to how raw it is. You know, Parannoul combines elements of shoegaze, emo, and post-rock on To See the Next Part of the Dream, and it's a sound that, you know, isn't original by any means, but it's still a sound I enjoy thoroughly. And Parannoul gets a lot of things right here, from the emo staples of hard-hitting and versatile drumming, incredibly great and catchy guitar riffs, and emotionally devastating lyrics, to the shoegaze staples of the dreamy yet noisy atmospheres that bleed pure bliss and catharsis. And they culminate incredibly well and work in Parannoul's favour for the most part, you know, creating some incredibly dense yet raw tracks that I could listen to for hours on end. You know, of course, Parannoul singing in Korean, obviously, so, you know, I decided to read through the lyrics that are on Bandcamp, and while listening to it, yeah, these lyrics are pretty dark, and you have to take in a lot. You know, the person in the lyrics just goes through a lot. They dream, but they feel held back by just so much, like, inferiority, you know, insecurities, anxiety. And, you know, I think that in many ways it's very nihilistic. It's incredibly nihilistic. Maybe at times too nihilistic for my liking, but there's moments in here that I could find some relatability and solace in. And even without the lyrics to keep in mind, I find solace in the album's instrumentation. Now, even with what I loved, I think this album isn't perfect. it mostly like doesn't feel that unique of an album in the grander scheme of shoegaze and emo, and even with how amazing the highs are in this album, it sort of tanks towards the end for me with some tracks that feel just very long-winded and samey, but I digress, because this album is fantastic in its own right, and, message from MickyT, support your favourite artists on Bandcamp, please. Thank you.
Strap in, dude. That's all I have to say. Put your fucking seatbelt on. And also, I'm fucking poor, and I will preface this by saying I fucking paid 15 for this on Bandcamp just because
so did I
felt like it. 15?
Yeah. Same price, let's go.
Artists, dude. And on that note, I'll now talk about this album. Get ready.
Okay.
I'm not really sure how to, exactly put into words how much this record blew me away. Parannoul is yet another artist that has only recently entered my radar, and I am so fucking glad that Rate Your Music pushed this project my way, and, a lot of people's way. I know it's early in the year, but to be honest, this is probably going to be my album of the year. I fucking love shoegaze. I fucking love emo. Combine those two, you already have my attention. But what this project does with my attention is take me on a absolutely breathtaking journey. Instrumental work here is just so complete, so dense, so hazy. The atmospheres created are beyond mesmerizing. The vocals sound so human, so pained, yet so distant and faint. It just has everything I look for in great shoegaze, and then some. But the emotion here is just so heavy, so potent. I also, read through the lyrics on Bandcamp. It's fucking dark. It is completely, as you said, nihilistic. It is one of the most depressing records I've ever listened to. But, the instrumentation just adds so much power and hope and just beauty to the music. And, I definitely do recommend looking through the lyrics because they add so much weight to this project when the topics that are being talked about. I will also finish by saying I am currently working on a review for my main channel. I'm making a comeback. I won't play all my cards right now. But this project is, in my opinion, perfect.
Whoa. Wait.
Best and worst tracks.
Wait.
Best and worst tracks.
Wait.
Best and worst tracks.
Okay, best and worst tracks. My favorite tracks are Beautiful World, Analog Sentimentalism, Age of Fluctuation, White Ceiling, See the Next Part of the Dream, and Youth Rebellion. My least favorite track is Excuse, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favorite tracks are Beautiful World, Excuse, Analog Sentimentalism, White Ceiling, To See the Next Part of the Dream, Age of Fluctuation, Youth Rebellion, Hearts, Extra Story, Chicken, I Can Feel My Heart Touching You. My least favorite tracks are none of them. I gave this album a 10 out of 10.
Fucking hell! Oh god damn!
I have the Radio Music and Album of the Year scores as a 9 for the last week just to keep this undercover. Yeah. But yep.
I was wondering,
perfect score.
Jesus, man. Fucking hell. This is the second time this has happened. Shit. Okay.
Oh yeah, the first time with me, for sure.
Yeah, my first one was the Clipping album, Visions of Bodies Being Burned, so there's that. But damn. Yeah,
my first
good
10.
shit. Content,
my first 10 out of 10 since Schlagenheim. And can Black Midi do a double? We'll find out later this year.
We'll find out later this year, and I'm very excited for that album. So, next we have Sketchy by Tune-Yards, and this is the 5th studio album from the Canadian art pop and indie electronica duo. And this is also Tune-Yards' first album in nearly 3 years, so it's been a good while since we've heard from them. But Sketchy happens to be the first Tune-Yards album I'm hearing, and even after a few listens to this record, I'm still a little unsure about how I feel about this album. I find their style interesting. They're very freaky, a little experimental in a sense, and to me, it's kind of wonky in a way, but I'm not sure if, this is my kind of thing. I usually like that kind of stuff, but I don't know. I don't know how I feel about Tune-Yards. I'll probably have to spin it a few times again, or some of their other albums, but, I don't know. It might be because the production doesn't do a whole lot for me, or the vocals, but I'm unsure. Like I said, I'll have to listen to it again, but I do like a lot of things about this album. I like their sound and style. I think this album has some pretty great highlights in its track list, and in general, I'd say there isn't a bad song on this album, but not many of the songs, specifically at the start of this record, do much for me, and they come off a little forgettable. With that in mind, though, I like their style, I like a lot of the songwriting, I like a lot of the experimentation, but unfortunately, not a whole lot of it lands for me, and just left me a little bit unsure, to say the least.
Yeah, no, honestly, another album that I don't have much to say about. Sketchy covers basically no new ground for Tune Yards. It's not really adventurous. A lot of the tracks, for me personally, bleed into one another. And, stylistically, it's definitely not an exciting leap from their previous albums. The production all over this project is often quite overcooked. And while there are some, seriously infectious cuts on this thing, they ultimately are the type of tracks that you kind of forget about the moment they're gone. They create a very, danceable, very infectious atmosphere in the spur of the moment. But, looking at this project through a magnifying glass, the production is kind of all over the place, in my opinion. There's nothing really stand out. There's nothing really awful. It's just one of the many mid albums that came out this month, and I will say I'll finish with that.
Okay. Alright, my favourite tracks from Sketchy are Hypnotized, Silence Part 1, My Neighbour, and Under Your Lip. My least favourite track is Be Not Afraid, and I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Hypnotized and Hold Yourself. My least favourite track was Homewrecker, and I give this album a light 5 out of 10.
Next we have Oh No by Xiu Xiu. This is the latest album from the experimental California outfit Xiu Xiu, and this is their major follow-up to their 2019 album, Girl with a Basket of Fruit, which I haven't revisited since my first initial listen to it, but I remember liking that album then. I still have yet to visit the rest of the Xiu Xiu discography. But this new one, Oh No, is out, and, I think it's decent. I'm not a fan of the album as a whole, but I think it has some merit to it. This endeavor from Xiu Xiu saw them do like a full-on duets record, where they get various collaborators from across the music sphere onto each track, and while that concept isn't anything unique or anything of that sort, each respective artist does leave their mark on their tracks for me. Sharon Van Etten, Chelsea Wolfe, Liz Harris in particular stood out to me with their contributions. And the record has some great standout tracks, like their cover of The Cure's 100 Years, as well as tracks like Saint Dymphna and A Bottle of Rum, and it even picks up a fair amount at the second half of the track list. But the first half of this album was just an absolute slog to sit through for me. It's just warbly drivel and airy bollocks. It's just, ugh. The textures are just very dull for me, and these tracks in the first half just feel like such a directionless detour of vapidness and boredom. It has moments, but as a whole, there's only a few remarkable qualities about this album, and Oh No is what I'll be saying if I'm forced to listen to the whole thing again. Just give me the second half of the album and I'm fine.
I will say Oh No, I think, is quite the ambitious project from Xiu Xiu, but each track, with each track containing one unique feature. And before delving into this project, my initial worry that, a lot of this may, end up being a recipe for a very disjointed and directionless album. But to the project's credit, I think it handles a lot of these features quite well. Each of them, play to the overall sonic direction of the album. I will say some are definitely better than others, but I think everyone plays their part for the most part. But honestly, I think the sonic direction I mentioned previously just isn't that interesting. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think this project stands out in, Xiu Xiu's discography. It just isn't interesting. It has some, more, what's the word? More colorful and more, just vibrant tracks than what you may, normally expect from the band. But it doesn't really execute much of what it attempts all that well. And overall, I think it feels like it tries to do something that it's not fully confident in a lot of the times. And the project just ends up, as you said, it just feels overly long and overly saturated with just tracks that aren't all that memorable. If not bad, they're just not memorable.
Yeah, I agree. My favourite tracks from Oh No are 100 Years, Saint Dymphna, and A Bottle of Rum. My least favourite tracks are Oh No, Fuzz Gong Fight, and Goodbye for Good. I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Sad Mescalita, Rumpus Room, and A Bottle of Rum. My least favorite track was It Bothers Me All the Time, and I gave this album a decent 5 out of 10.
Next, we have Green to Gold by the Antlers. This is the 6th studio album from the indie and dream pop band. And this is the group's first album in 7 years, but much like Tune Yards, this is my first album experience with them. And honestly, I do wish this wasn't my introduction, because I'm very indifferent towards a lot of what they done on Green to Gold. I just felt nothing listening to this, man, you know. Here's the thing though. I like the warm and tranquil sound of this album, that what it goes for, but I just feel like the soundscape doesn't make up for what this album lacks, and that's something interesting to hold on to and take away. I feel like where the album's soundscapes falter is how skeletal, slow burning, and sleepy it is. I think that it's often pretty bland in the instrumentals, and from the instrumentals to the vocals, and there just isn't there's just nothing that awaits me on these tracks except boredom. Maybe I can get why people would like the nice, dreamy folk soundscape, but there's nothing really here that I could latch onto. Nothing bad, nothing good, but it's just, I don't know, it's just very okay, man. I felt nothing listening to this album.
Yeah, honestly, I'm kind of there. I'm kind of there with you, but also I disagree. I do understand where you're coming from. I do think that this album is just a little too skeletal. It feels a little derivative of a lot of things that I've heard just not only recently but throughout the years. But this is the Antlers' first album in 7 years, and even though at first it's quite unassuming, the more I listen and engulf myself in the project, the more I really start to enjoy the more tranquil and stripped back approach of this project. And I genuinely do really enjoy it. I didn't really feel that way on my first listen. I developed more of a interest in this album the more I listened to it. But, Green to Gold to me is a gorgeous album. And while it's simplistic and lo-fi in its nature, I still think it builds some very lush and colourful and serene soundscapes with its limited instrumentation and Peter's heartfelt and faint vocals. But at the same time, it's just not really ambitious. I don't think it tries to be. I do, enjoy the more dreamy and indie folk approach that the band undertakes here. But ultimately, as much as I enjoyed it, I don't think this is going to go down as anything, special in the band's discography or in, 2021 in terms of music.
So, my favorite track is Solstice. And I don't really have a least favorite because I don't remember anything from this album, and I gave it a 5.
My favorite tracks are Wheels Roll Home, Solstice, Stubborn Man, Green to Gold. My least favorite track is It Is What It Is, and I give this album a very light 7 out of 10.
Okay, next we have OK Orchestra by AJR. And this is the 4th studio album from the brotherly New York pop trio. And for years now, AJR has been putting out music that I can only really describe as the musical embodiment of a stock image. Like, their previous albums, The Click and Neo Theater, pretty much embodied everything I dislike about really shitty, overblown, generic and trite millennial pop music. And I will say, their takes on it are clearly trying to be more ambitious as they try and incorporate some concepts into their music. But 9 times out of 10, their concepts fall flat on their faces because, to put it simply, they just try way too hard to be quirky and they just cannot write good songs to save their lives, in my opinion. I might be harsh on them, but honestly, I cannot find much else to praise their music for. It just feels so hollow, soulless, derivative, and overblown to the point of being unlistenable. And, I wanted to go into their newest album, OK Orchestra, with no expectations and enjoy it. But even with that, I still heavily dislike this album. To start with some positives, I can commend AJR for once again attempting to be ambitious, and I will say this is their best album, but unfortunately that doesn't mean much because, to put it bluntly, AJR proved once again they're incapable of making interesting and listenable music. And OK Orchestra is just more of the same wannabe, quirky and hollow garbage. And once again, their production style is awful. Their overblown sound mix and incorporations of tropes render these tracks unlistenable and generic. And, even with the weird samples and different styles they try to throw in, it just still ends up being manufactured and malformed Carad music. The vocalist, I still think he is one of the most derivative and personality devoid singers of any group in recent memory. He just sounds like an emotionally flat version of the guy from Fun. And it doesn't help that the material he's singing about is just so badly written. It just, sometimes it's so awful that it should be parody. But it's not the case, unfortunately. I'm not even going to pretend that I'm surprised either. Yeah, I'm not even surprised. I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, like this album enjoying the AJR Defense Brigade. Well, I'm sorry, their music is just too awful, and I can't pretend to not hate it. So, yeah, in summary, meh.
Again, I won't waste anyone's time, because does anyone really expect me to sit here and tell them that the new AJR album isn't fucking complete wank? It is. It's everything Mick said. I don't know who this music is supposed to appeal to, but I guarantee you that, their Spotify is a fucking cesspool of everything that's on the radio, and I mean, nothing against them personally, but fuck you, whoever you are.
I have nothing against them personally either. They just make horrible music. So, yeah, the best track is OK Overture, and the worst tracks are Way Less Sad, 3 O'Clock Things, Humpty Dumpty Adventure is out there, Ordinary-ish People, and World's Smallest Violin. And I gave this album a light 2.
My favourite track is My Play. My least favourite tracks are 3 O'Clock Things, Joe Adventure is out there, Bang, The Trick, Ordinary-ish People, Humpty Dumpty, The World's Smallest Violin, and Way Less Sad. And I gave this album a light 2 out of 10.
Some of these song titles are so bad.
Yeah, Jesus fucking Christ. You don't even have to listen to the project.
Literally. Okay,
Humpty
so...
Dumpty. What a fucking banger of a track. Imagine if a track called Humpty Dumpty was good.
Imagine, but you can't really make it good when you're a 30-year-old man writing the lyrics. That's the thing. So, next we have Is For Lovers by Death From Above 1979. And this is the 4th studio album from the Canadian dance punk band. And, I've seen this band around before, but I've never taken the opportunity to listen to them. So, Is For Lovers is my first experience with this band. But, much like Tune Yards and the Antlers, I wish I'd started at a different point. But what differs from this album is the fact that Is For Lovers is more of a mess, if anything. And I don't understand how you fucked up this bad. My main issue with Is For Lovers is a lot of the production. While I think that the very noisy and raw dance punk sound could have been done well, and it has its moments, it ultimately gets rendered as this mess of overbearing distortion, awful vocals, and awful drum sounds. They combine in the most ugly way possible, and every time I've finished I've finished this album, I've gotten a fucking headache. It was that overbearing. The mix is garbage. Now, even with that in mind, a lot of the songs at the core are just not there. The riffs are very plain. The songs are very forgettable. The songwriting is mediocre. The sound palette is migraine fuel. And in general, there's just only maybe 1 or 2 tracks I enjoyed. The silver lining is it's only 30 minutes. And in general, I don't think it's an awful album. I just think it's very sloppy that it's painful.
Yeah, no, this project honestly just falls flat for me. Compositionally, these tracks just fly by with memorable moments few and far between. The guitar work throughout is fine, but I'm really not fond of the guitar tone. It just sounds so dry and compressed and just really painful to listen to. And considering this is Death From Above, guitar is the backbone of this entire album, that is far from a good thing. I've never been too fond of the group's work past their debut, and this project just does nothing to convince me otherwise. It's really just very synthetic and very uneventful and very drab, and I honestly just don't enjoy it.
I agree. My favourite track is 1 and 1. The worst tracks are NYC Power Elite 1 and 2, Totally Wiped Out, and Mean Streets, and I gave this album a decent 4.
My favourite tracks are NY Power Elite Part 1 and 2, and my least favourite track was Glass Homes, and I give this album a decent 4 out of 10.
Next we have DEACON by Serpentwithfeet. This is the sophomore album from the Maryland singer-songwriter, and Serpentwithfeet is a name I've been familiar with for a little while now. His 2018 album was getting a lot of traction when it came out in the R&B community, and I've seen this album getting mentioned a lot on YouTube lists and stuff like that at the time, and I haven't seen this album I haven't listened to the album myself. I probably should, but for now, DEACON is the topic of discussion today, and personally, I wasn't a huge fan of it. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. There's things that I can admire about this album, like the vocals and the themes, but besides that, DEACON just feels like a bit of a rushed project for me. Feels a little underwritten, especially in some of the lyrics. Some tracks on this thing just seem a little thrown together and not really that well fleshed out. I'm not too keen on a lot of the production either. It just seems very flavorless, washed out, a little flat to me. And in general, there was just only really one memorable moment for me. Besides that, I'm pretty indifferent toward a lot of the songs in this project. There's definitely talent there. I just feel like it needs to be more fleshed out, and I think there should be more interesting production choices and just a little bit more substantial qualities on pretty much every front.
Yeah, honestly, DEACON to me just sounds like Serpent with Feet, completely phoning it in and playing it far too safe. Instrumentally, it doesn't do anything exciting or noteworthy. It sounds so frail and airy, and honestly just plays to a lot of contemporary R&B tropes. Songwriting, while not downright bad, isn't really anything to write home about. And honestly, I think Soil was an enjoyable project, and one where Serpent with Feet showcased a lot of potential. But on DEACON, a lot of that potential just isn't put to good use, in my opinion. And the album just completely falls flat. It just sounds really frail and generic. I do think that Serpent with Feet is capable of, some very creative and interesting stuff, and I don't doubt that that this is going to be the best it gets from here on out, but this project just isn't interesting at all to me.
I agree. My favourite tracks are Heartstorm, and my least favourite track is Derek's Beard, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favourite track is Fellowship, my least favourite track is Derek's Beard, and I give this album a strong 4 out of 10.
Next we have Tonic Immobility by Tomahawk. This is the 5th studio album from the alternative rock supergroup fronted by the one and only Mike Patton. And Tomahawk is one of many Mike Patton projects, and Mike has been bringing back some of these projects lately, like Mr. Bungle came back last year, and now this year we have Tomahawk, their first album in 8 years, and I have so little to say about this album because I just straight up dislike it. I do not like it at all. I think that this album is only here so that we can watch Mike Patton get old, and it's sad, honestly. He tries way too hard on this album, especially with some of the lyrics, which are just straight up dog shit at times. And while his vocals are decent, he's just very boring this time around for me. The production for the most part sounds good and is pretty clean, but besides that, it's just very plain, very forgettable. A lot of the riffs are mediocre, and the project just feels passionless, in my opinion. It doesn't really have a good track, in my opinion. It's mostly just very mediocre to bad material that has no reason to exist. What purpose does Mike Patton serve in the 2020s anyway? And yeah, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, no, I'm there with you. I just did not enjoy the album. I think this new Tomahawk project is a completely underwhelming display of alternative rock and alternative metal pastiche of the worst kind. The instrumentation is completely directionless. It's generic. The riffing, the guitar work in particular, is just so limp and so lifeless that it becomes a chore to listen to. Mike Patton's vocals are okay. I mean, they largely seem to be playing everything far too safe. I mean, this album just does nothing that hasn't already been done. I've said this a few times before. It's just very derivative and boring, and I sound like a broken record, but it's honestly, I was gonna say it's not that interesting, but it's kind of just downright bad. I won't even give it any credit. It's bad.
Yeah. My favorite tracks were Shh. The worst track is Sidewinder. Sidewinder. I can't read today. Sorry. Dogs Eat Dogs and Tattoo Zero, and I gave this album a light 3.
My favorite track was Valentine Shine. My least favorite tracks were Tattoo Zero, Eureka, and Dog Eat Dog, and I gave this album a decent 3 out of 10.
Next we have Haram by Armand Hammer and The Alchemist. This is the 5th studio album from the New York underground hip-hop duo Armand Hammer, and this is their first collaboration with legendary producer The Alchemist. Billy Woods and Elucid are back with this new album not too long after their album Shrines, which I thought was a good album. It had some great hardcore hip-hop cuts on it, but it wasn't anything amazing or standout to me. But I was excited for Haram because when I found out that they were going to be working with The Alchemist, I was expecting some great things because The Alchemist is one of my favorite producers in hip hop right now. He had a great year in 2020 with releases from Conway the Machine, Boldy James, and especially Freddie Gibbs. So I was excited to see what he could do with this dark underground and abstract like group that Armand Hammer are. And it took me a little bit to fully grasp this project, but after listening to it a few times, I can safely say that I think that HARAM is great. I think it's a great album in my opinion. The Alchemist has always had a good sense of space, and he's great at making beats that best suit the artist, case in point his most recent collaborations with Freddie Gibbs and Boldy James. And given Armand Hammer's very dark, cutthroat and abstract lyricism alongside their abstract spoken word flows, he makes beats for them that not only work in the context of Armand Hammer's sound, but they also manage to challenge the duo artistically, given the duo have not rapped over beats that are like this trippy, subtly psychedelic or surreal. As a result, we get a project that feels like Armand Hammer's most interesting sound and one of their most provocative statements, in my opinion. Of course, I've always enjoyed Billy Woods and Elucid's rapping style and dark lyrics, but HARAM feels like Billy Woods and Elucid are on the same page, better than they ever were before. When it comes to their flows and rhyme schemes, they throw so much at you that it's hard to take in all at once, and that only makes me want to go back and dissect this project further because of how dense everything is on here. They even try to expand into more melodic territories at points, but overall these melodic attempts seem pretty woeful and they kind of drag down the album for me. But in my opinion, I think that this is one of Armand Hammer's best albums, and I took away plenty of material from this album, so yeah.
I will preface this by saying I do think the album is good. I just don't think HARAM sees either of the Armand Hammer boys or the Alchemist at their absolute peak. But nonetheless, it's a very dense, very intense and entrancing project with plenty of highlights scattered throughout its track listing. Lyrically, there's just so much to gather from the bars being produced throughout. Plenty of insanely creative and memorable lines, but that's almost a given. And, The Alchemist, truly sets a very uneasy and dark atmosphere with his instrumentals. But I will say that a lot of his instrumentals here, to me at least, sound very derivative of a lot of his previous works. And, a lot of other notable abstract hip-hop artists and projects in recent years. Notably, the production on here just reminds me so much of, a lot of the Griselda projects that have been coming out in drones recently. I do think The Alchemist still does a great job at setting the atmosphere for Elucid and Billy Woods to, shine. But I just don't think that this project is going to go down as the most memorable Alchemist project or the most memorable Armand Hammer project.
I don't get the Griselda comparison at all.
I don't know what it is, but I think just the sampling in particular just really reminds me of a lot of Griselda projects. That could be something I only see, but it just is a bit distracting to me.
I don't know. I personally don't see it at all. I don't feel.
Alchemist has worked with Griselda before, so
yeah, he has. But I don't think the
that
beats
could
on this,
be why.
That's the thing. I don't think the beats on this album aren't as what's the way to describe them? I feel like on this Armand Hammer album, they feel a bit more subtly psychedelic and way more trippy than dissonant.
I've always found
a lot of what we saw on Griselda albums. I don't know. Griselda just feel more, just kind of grimy in a sense that they pay respects to the old school hip hop scene. But I don't know. Maybe
I think both of those, both this project and a lot of Griselda projects are both very trippy and psychedelic and also grimy at once. I do see both of those things in both of the projects I've mentioned. So I guess it's just a matter of little things standing out more to me than they would to you and vice versa.
Maybe, but I feel what differs them for me is just the dissonance that comes from this Armand Hammer album. I feel that's where it comes from me. I don't know. Griselda feel more honestly. Griselda feel more straightforward rather than abstract to me.
I think Griselda isn't at all straightforward.
I mean, they're kind of straightforward. They're kind of straightforward for what they try to do. They're pretty straightforward for the old school sound that they go for. Yeah, just enough bickering. This is just going to go on for hours.
No, it's interesting.
I don't know. I don't know. The dynamic is there for me, but if you don't see it, I don't know. Maybe I'm just going insane.
I'll definitely be revisiting this project because I did enjoy it. I don't know. I think everyone involved has done better stuff, and I'm not that blown away.
Fair enough, I guess. Alright, my favourite tracks from HARAM are Black Sunlight, Aubergine, Indian Summer, and Squeegee. And the worst track is Chickarones, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favourite tracks on HARAM were Roaches Don't Fly, Black Sunlight, Aubergine, Falling Out the Sky. My least favourite track was Pepper Tree, and I gave this album a very strong 6 out of 10.
That's sad. Okay. And the final album we're going to be talking about today is From Me to You by Quadeca. This is the 6th studio album from the singer, rapper, producer, and YouTuber. And, I've never watched that many videos from Quadeca or heard much of his music, but what I have heard has never really impressed me. He just seemed like another YouTube rapper to me, but what made him stand out a little bit from his contemporaries was the fact that he latched onto like an emo rap sound that clearly wanted to be something bigger than what it was, but even then it came off rather forced and corny to me. Well, it seemed like that could have changed with this album, as the singles that teased this album were gaining very positive reviews, and as a whole the album was garnering a lot of positive reception from music fans, so I was kind of hopeful that Quadeca really did make something worthwhile. But honestly, after listening to it a few times, I don't really get much from this album at all. To start with the positives, I can respect that Quadeca wanted to challenge himself with a lot of what he presented on here, and his experimental tendencies are admirable for the most part. And to his credit, this is one of the more interesting and ambitious musical undertakings from a YouTube name like himself. But as a whole, this was just a slog to sit through for me, and that was for a number of reasons. I suppose I'll explain my main gripe with it, which, funnily enough, was what I praised it for, and that's Quadeca's attempts at being experimental. Aside from a few tracks, there isn't much on From Me to You that is substantive or satisfying, and these experimental sounds seem like an attempt at making the listener think that there's something more going on when in reality there isn't, because at the core these tracks don't really have much to them. It's rather very uninteresting, it's very unoriginal. In fact, some of it is incredibly trite, and it just renders these tracks to nothing but a boring mess for me. Another thing that bugs me is the record's production. While it isn't anything painstakingly egregious or terrible to the point where it's unlistenable, it's incredibly messy to me. A lot of the mixes that Quadeca opts to incorporate are very crummy and brittle to me, often to the point where it feels like he's blowing out the mix to make it as large as he can, and it's very grating. And a part of me wants to say that he only did this because he could pass it off as being creative or cutting edge, when in reality it just kind of sounds like a mess, and it it just happens on most of the cuts on this album. Quadeca himself, he doesn't make these tracks work for me. He has improved in his singing voice, and I will admit that he can pull off an impressive flow, but none of the flows he uses are smooth or satisfying to me. They're often quite derivative and kind of boring, and I just can't help but wince whenever he uses like that speedy, spiritual miracle lyrical flow. His delivery isn't the best either. It can work on some of the melodrama, to be fair, but I dislike the melodrama that this album presented, and you can bet that didn't help. And even then, the lyrics drag this album, because I could appreciate the emotiveness, but there's just so many corny bars and 21st century white boy blues on this album, so much to the point where I kind of struggled to sit through the whole thing. And finally, where this album holds me back is in its track list. I think it's bloated. That probably have to do with the fact that I found a lot of the material on this album to be incredibly boring. And I'm sure that everyone who likes this album probably doesn't have that issue. But Jesus, the amount of interludes and bland filler seems so unnecessary. And given that it pads out the album to an hour's length, it just doesn't help. I could say more, but what else is there to say? I don't really enjoy this Quadeca album. I think it's pretty mediocre.
Yeah, I'm there with you. I mean, its first few tracks especially are honestly quite misleading. Sisyphus in particular, I listened to that track last week before this project dropped, and I was mind blown. It still is an incredible track, incredibly potent. I love this subtle experimentation, and it's some of the most creative and ambitious emo rap I've ever heard. And I was expecting a lot more of the same, a lot of this album to follow in the very epic and theatrical and experimental approach. But after the first few tracks, I think the album just completely drops off in terms of quality. Most of this album is just very inoffensive, run-of-the-mill emo rap, with the occasional, cool and experimental production quirk throughout. But for the most part, it's just not all that exciting. I don't think Quadeca stands out from a lot of contemporaries. I do think, obviously, the first track in particular shows some very serious potential, something that, isn't usually associated with YouTube rappers. But, this album doesn't really do much to reach that potential. The lyrics are oftentimes awfully corny. The production is oftentimes quite stale and uninteresting. And the project just falls flat after the first few tracks.
Fair enough. Even then, I didn't care about Sisyphus at all. I thought it was just...
I fucking love that track.
I don't know, I just hated the mix on that song so much. So, funnily enough, my favourite track was Sisyphus and Candles on Fire. My least favourite tracks are Work and Where'd You Go? And I gave this album a light 4.
My favourite tracks were Sisyphus, Candles on Fire, and Maybe Another Day. My least favourite track was Shades of Us, and I gave this album a light 5 out of 10.
Alright, and that's done. We've covered every album that we've wanted to talk about now. And it's time to worst on to our Song of the Month and the worst and best albums. And starting with Best Song of the Month, I want to give 2 honourable mentions to singles that weren't on any albums. So I'm going to firstly mention Leave the Door Open by Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak, Silk Sonic. I thought that was an amazing track. And, of course, I gotta give it to Buzzcut by Brockhampton, featuring Danny Brown. Bring on Roadrunner, I'm excited for that. And my Song of the Month has to go to Drown by Genesis Owusu.
I also want to give some shout-outs to some singles that didn't appear on an album this month. They may be eligible for Song of the Month later down the line. Firstly, also Buzzcut by Brockhampton. An incredible return to form for the boys. I'm excited to see what they do on this new project. And also, possibly my favourite song of the year so far, John L. by Black Midi.
Shit, I forgot to mention that. Actually put that in there as well.
Yeah, what a mental track. I am beyond excited for this new
It's
Black
so
Midi
insane.
project.
It's so insane. I'm so excited for the new Black Midi album. It's going to be amazing.
When it comes to albums that were released this month, I want to give a shout out to Quadeca with Sisyphus and Genesis Owusu with Don't Need You. But my Song of the Month is Parannoul with Analog Sentimentalism.
Nice. Okay, and moving on to best and worst albums, we will start with the worst albums. Give our 3 picks for that. My number 3 is Tonic Immobility by Tomahawk.
Number 3. Sorry, I'm just looking. Tomahawk, Tonic Immobility as well. I was just looking at my favourite tracks and I got really confused.
Okay. My number 2 is Poster Girl, Zara Larsson.
My number 2 is Justin Bieber, Justice.
And my number 1 is OK Orchestra, AJR.
Yep, I'm right there with you.
Who's surprised? Okay,
Buddy.
Now moving on to best albums. Now, one of my picks is literally a 6 out of 10, so yeah, you go to show the quality. So,
Same.
okay, so my number 5 is Oh No by Xiu Xiu.
My number 5 is Armand Hammer and the Alchemist, Haram.
My number 4 is As Days Get Dark, Arab Strap.
My number 4 is Tiger's Jaw, I Won't Care How You Remember Me.
My number 3 is To See the Next Part of the Dream by Parannoul.
My number 3 is The Antlers, Green to Gold.
My number 2 is Haram, Armand Hammer and the Alchemist.
And my number 2 is Genesis Owusu, Smiling with No Teeth.
And my number 1 is Smiling with No Teeth by Genesis Owusu.
My number 1 is Parannoul, To See the Next Part of the Dream. Obviously.
10 out of 10, baby!
Yeah!
And with that in mind, that is the end of today's episode. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We hope that you enjoyed. What were some of your favourite and least favourite albums of March? Please let us know. We'd love to know. As always, necessary links to our Rate Your Music pages, Album of the Year pages, and our own individual channels are going to be in the description. I hope to come back to YouTube soon. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
See you!
Peace.